While 58 years are but a fleeting moment in China's 5,000-year history, it can constitute a person's entire lifetime. Back in 1957, when unanticipated events brought me to China, I was only 26. But the few weeks which I spent there changed the direction of my life. During the decades which passed, no matter where I found myself, back home in the USA, or filming in such places as Cuba or Africa, there was always a little voice that whispered, "Go back to China, go back to China." And so it was that 58 years later, in 2015, I once again set foot in this familiar yet now strangely transformed land. As I approached my 85th birthday, I wondered if I could find any trace of what I remembered from my first visit, and what changes the passage of more than half a century had brought to that vast nation, the home of close to 1/4 of the human race. In 1957, I first traveled by train for 9 days across Siberia from Moscow to Beijing. Then, during the next 6 weeks, with a hand-wound 16mm camera and only 11 rolls for about 30 minutes of film, I visited and filmed 8 cities across China.
In direct contrast to the flood of anti-American propaganda was the greeting given to a group of young Americans who visited China back in 1957. A crowd of 3,000 Chinese students met them at the Peking railway station with applause and bouquets of flowers.
Thousands of young Chinese there when we started singing John Brown's Body. At least that was the melody. I don't know the words, but the melody was the song John Brown's Body. John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave.
When our nation's largest television network asked me to take films inside China, I decided to face whatever risks might be involved and accepted the assignment.
Inside Red China was a breakthrough film because no other Westerner had access to the everyday Chinese activities socially, politically, and culturally in 1957.
I think a lot of people looked upon Robert Cohen as a renegade, as a troublemaker.
During a 6-week trip, I traveled over 7,000 miles in this land which is larger than either the United States or Canada, and which is inhabited by almost 700 million people. The films I took there were airmailed back to New York before being developed. Not a single frame was censored or even seen by the communists.
It just was a whole other world. So it was a real window in to another world.
In 2015, 58 years after my first visit, accompanied by my wife Kim, I am reliving that past journey. In addition to Beijing, our visit is to include the cities of Shanghai, Guangzhou, Wuhan, Nanjing, Changchun, Dalian, Hangzhou, Shenzhen, Shanhaiquan, and Jiaoyuquan. During the journey, which will cover over 12,000 kilometers and include a dozen cities, our two camera crews will record more than 300 hours of video. While it will be impossible to show everything there is to see in China, what you are about to see is what you would be seeing if you were here with us. While it was evident that China had changed fundamentally, I wondered what that change would mean to the world. Would the 21st century see the new China, the largest organization of people in history, bring hope to humanity, or would it become a threat to world peace?
We're standing here in Tiananmen Square in front of the Gate of Heavenly Peace, which is effectively the capital of China. This is kind of the equivalent of the Washington Mall, the Washington Monument, and the White House all in one area. And what we're seeing are thousands and thousands of tourists from different parts of China. Tour groups, each one with different color flags, some with different little colored hats on them. And they've come here today because we're just concluding the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, which was celebrated on September the 3rd. It's very interesting for me because when I was first here in 1957, everyone was wearing what was called the national uniform. But today we see it's all clothing from every possible part of the world. Quite a different scene.
Beijing, the capital and political center of the People's Republic of China, is a super city, a megalopolis of close to 21 million inhabitants. Today, in 2015, its population is 5 times greater than when I first visited there in 1957. The Chinese view Tiananmen Square, located in the center of the city, as the heart of their nation. Here, in one of the most visited places in China, you can see people from the 4 corners of the world. The site of many of China's major political and historical events of the past several hundred years, it has witnessed both the glory of the country, its decline, and now its resurrection.
This display has been put up for the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. In the United States, it's celebrated at a different date, but here in China, it's celebrated on September the 3rd because that's when they signed the peace treaty with the Japanese who had invaded China and occupied China. The atmosphere today, of course, is quite different from what it was on my first visit in 1957, and certainly different from what it was 70 years ago, because now we're in a China which has been at peace for many, many years, and it's mirrored in the way the people are behaving, the way they're dressed, and so on. Occasionally, we'll see a very old person who perhaps had been here in 1945. I was 15 at the time, and I'm sure there are people here in their 90s, and so, but it's really a totally different feeling than it was in 57. Very gratifying.
One of the basic principles of our democracy.
There is very little scientific support for such practices in the West, but they are believed in quite strongly. Former rocket expert from the California Institute of Technology. Modern docks were built in Dairen by Japan as part of their exploitation of Manchuria's coal and iron deposits. Her mother watches as she gets the acupuncture treatment. Although given no anesthetic, she shows hardly any pain.
Based on your personal experience in China, were you treated friendly by our government and the people here?
Was I treated friendly? I felt in 1957 that we must have been the special guests of Zhou Enlai, because I, as a journalist, was permitted to film things which no American journalist had ever been permitted to film. There weren't any here. People said to me, how could you film this? How could you film that? I said, the only logic to it is that high people in the Chinese government believe that it is a good thing to establish this relationship. I have never had a bad opinion or a bad gesture made to me in China. The Chinese are excellent hosts.
This is the first time that the film I shot in 1957 as an NBC TV special correspondent is being shown in China. 58 years ago, authorized at the highest level, possibly by Premier Chou En-lai himself, I was permitted to mail my undeveloped films via Moscow to NBC in New York, where they were then developed and televised throughout the USA. Since NBC only used those scenes which showed some of the 41 Americans who had come to China in defiance of the US government's then existing travel ban, I retained ownership of the remainder, which included footage of such things as Chairman Mao Zedong, military jet aircraft, and the October 1st National Day Parade. At first, I showed my films of China at small gatherings in private homes and at coffee houses in Los Angeles. Then, after a friend suggested that I edit my footage into a silent film lecture, I did so and began presenting it at universities and in public auditoriums throughout the USA and Canada. Finally, in the early 1960s, after adding music and sound effects, titled Inside Red China, I was able to have it syndicated worldwide as part of the Special of the Week television series. Before my documentary began to be shown throughout the USA during the 1960s as part of the Special of the Week series, most Americans had seen very little about the People's Republic of China. What little was shown almost always focused on scare headlines, which depicted China as a threat. As a reporter of fact rather than opinion, I tried to show only what I saw, leaving it up to the viewers to judge for themselves.
The idea for making this film was part of a sequence. I did my master's in film at UCLA in 1954. I was drafted. I was a TV director in the U.S. Army and was then a cameraman.
Because there were relatively few television networks, relatively few television stations. And so Robert Cohen took his images and his story directly to people all across America.
My impression was I couldn't believe anybody had made this movie in 1957, and I think everybody was surprised that until 1971 and Richard Nixon went to China, if you were an American, lots of Americans kind of pretended it wasn't there.
I think this is a particularly sympathetic treatment of China. This was somebody who had, I think, very forward thinking style. He was prepared to see good things in the Communist Revolution.
China is so vast that not even a 45-day visit is enough to catch more than a glimpse of it. Also, without living in a country for years, even the most observant reporter cannot experience the daily joys and sorrows which are most important of all to the average man. Yet I was able to see many things. I filmed both new factories and severely primitive ways of doing things, both modern health techniques and crowded slums. And I saw both the gigantic campaign for peace and friendship and the equally gigantic campaign of anti-U.S. propaganda.
Paris, I came back to Moscow. From Moscow, I came to
Although many of the young people who saw my film here at the university were only around 20 years old, while I, being 85, was older than most of their grandfathers, I enjoyed communicating with them.
Although, for me as an individual,
Never before having seen a similar film about their nation's history, they were extremely interested, asking many questions, which I did my best to answer.
Why you can still come back to China 2 years ago. This time is changing. This time is changing.
Well, there are more people studying English in China than speak English in the United States. You have 300 million students, and you're all required to study English. Very few American students study Chinese, even today. I think that Chinese people are learning more about the United States than Americans are learning about China.
Entering through the Tiananmen Gate on the north, you find yourself in front of what was once the world's largest royal dwelling, the Imperial Palace, or, as it is still commonly called, the Forbidden City. China's last empire, the Qing dynasty, ended here. All the governmental decrees of China's last two dynasties were first issued here, then distributed throughout the empire. For centuries, it was a crime for ordinary people to even approach the Forbidden City. Today, the formerly closely guarded palace has become one of China's most popular tourist attractions. Anyone able to purchase a 60 yuan, or $10 ticket, can enter. The once all-powerful rulers are gone. And what was once the world's greatest empire is now ruled by the representatives of the descendants of what used to be the nation's humble subjects, a transformation which has taken place only within the past 100 years. China went from being an agrarian nation with mostly animal and human-powered technology directly into the 21st century. And all the problems of the 20th century and 21st century compressed together in a very short period of time. And these problems will have to be dealt with. They are being dealt with, but there's a new China now, and a new China that has the problems of the new world of the 21st century. But that parade on October the 1st, 1957, I could see the image of the future there in that parade. China in the 1950s was a highly organized society. Everyone worked at a publicly owned factory or facility called a danwei, which means a section or unit. In addition to their place of work, everyone's leisure time and even family life was also highly organized and controlled by the government. The leaders of a person's unit were even required to involve themselves in such things as who one associated with or was permitted to marry. Farmers were organized into people's communes, with everyone working together in publicly owned fields. No one was permitted to buy or own land, buildings, or other major private property. Travel outside of one's local area was strictly controlled. During that era, the word tourism had virtually disappeared from the Chinese vocabulary. Today, the situation appears to have completely changed. Except for military installations or areas considered dangerous because of weapons testing or industrial processes, people appear to be able to travel freely wherever they wish to go. Shichahai, the largest and most well-preserved historical area in Beijing, has also become a center for fashion and popular culture. At night, its colorfully illuminated lanes, restaurants, bars, and music clubs are crowded with young people. Yao Honggang, a wrestler, China's first gold belt winner in mixed martial art fighting in the Asia-Pacific region, now operates his own boxing gym. Prior to this, he was known as a drifter, a word which the Chinese use to describe those who come from other provinces to try and make a living in Beijing. In order to survive, Hong Gang had worked for 10 years as a night watchman, an air conditioner installer, a cook, and a security guard. In 2008, shortly after the Olympic Games, after years of engaging in amateur fighting matches, he joined a gym and began systematic training.
刚开始来北京就是出来打工嘛，你去来北京是首都嘛，还是最想去的、最想来的地方。就是每年就是过春节回去一次，平常不回去，就一直在北京，就是什么都做。我也喜欢这一行，特别喜欢这一行，就是觉得我现在还没有到顶峰。我觉得如果有一家自己的拳馆，那是自己最大的，也是一个梦想吧。像这2年我多打比赛，就是一直在参加比赛。就是去年我在中国所有的 MMA 运动员里面我最多的，别人都知道，就是姚洪刚一年别人可能打3场、打4场、打5场，我可能打6场、7场、8场，多打一些比赛，多攒一些钱。
The Temple of Heaven in Beijing was where the emperors of the Ming and Qing dynasties gave sacrificial offerings in order to try and ensure good harvests. It was the largest architectural work in China dedicated to worshiping the gods. In traditional Chinese culture, the emperors thought their power was bestowed upon them by the will of heaven. Ordinary people as well believed that if someone had good luck, he should give thanks by paying tribute to heaven. On the other hand, if one should encounter any bad luck, he should pray to heaven for the return of good fortune. Today, the Communist Party of China, stating that it considers that people themselves are heavenly and that public interest is more important than praying to heaven,
May I ask you, what's the names of the documentaries you had been sorted in China in the time of 1950?
1957.
Oh, what's the name of it?
My film was called Inside Red China.
Inside
Red China.
Oh, Inside of Red China, oh, really great! War, yeah. That can show the Westerners or the people of Americans how China is going to be.
And now we show how it has changed.
How it will change. Oh, really, that's great. This is a very positive way of reporting China. Not the negative.
No?
Not negative. You are the great. At that times, most Westerners want to demonstrate the image of China.
I know.
Yeah, but you are great. Just outstanding from among them.
I show the truth.
Yeah?
I show what is real, what is true.
You know what is true in it.
Yes.
Oh, great!
It's not great, I see reality.
Yeah, reality. So these people, you are the great people.
Following the assumption of power by the communists in 1949, virtually all official exchanges between the USA and China halted. Even after the group of 41 Americans visited China in 1957, the door of people-to-people exchange between our countries remained closed. While a few individual Americans still managed to visit China after 1957, it wasn't until the commencement of Nixon's ping-pong diplomacy in 1971 that the situation began to change significantly. From the back, I'm doing this. There I am again. We were looking for shots of Americans and possibly a shot of myself. I saw several shots of people that I knew there, most of whom are dead. In fact, everyone I've seen so far has died in the last few years. The only shots of me are over my shoulder, side of my head, and so on, because I was too busy filming the events. But it's very interesting for me in the form of memory to now sit here in 2015 and look at scenes that I took, that I was participating in 58 years ago. It's very interesting. But essentially, I knew that I wasn't being filmed because I was too busy doing the filming. But I was able to spot the lenses on my camera, which were different from the lenses on the other cameras. The fact that I was wearing a white shirt and the other cameramen were not. Of course, the scenes of Chou Enlai, Ho Lung, Xian Chufen, and other people, I recognized because I was filming them, and we can see those in my footage as well. I assumed that because there were so many Chinese newsroom cameramen filming, that unless during the Cultural Revolution it had been destroyed, I assumed that there was some footage left, but I have no way of knowing. This is the first time I've seen this material. I'm on my way to Wuhan by high-speed train. Sitting opposite me is Mr. Ren Fa-de, who is 83 years old. His career as an expert in bridge photography started back in 1957, when, while I was filming it for NBC TV, he photographed the Wuhan Yangtze River Bridge.
This photo is in 1957年，武汉长江大桥通车前夕，毛主席到大桥来视察。那个时候我记得呢，可能当时下午黄昏时候，毛主席亲自在桥面信步从汉口的汉阳岸向长那边走。
I never had the opportunity of meeting Chairman Mao because I was filming a group of American students, and only 2 or 3 of the students had the opportunity to meet him. But I filmed him on the Tiananmen, on the National Day, so I filmed him from a distance. Chou Enlai, I was able to interview him in the seat of the State Council. The Wuhan Bridge was built with Soviet help in the mid-1950s, only a few years after the People's Republic of China was founded. Referred to as the first bridge of the Yangtze, it is mentioned in Mao Zedong's well-known single-line poem. A bridge rises high over the north and south. Nature's barrier is transformed into a thoroughfare. Construction began in September 1955 and was completed and opened to traffic 2 years later on October 15, 1957. While I was filming there in September of that year, the workers were putting on the final touch by paving the roadway. With a total length of 1,670 meters, or over 1 mile, it's high enough for major ocean-going ships to pass underneath. An early example of Sino-Soviet cooperation, the bridge retains many traditional Chinese elements. Although the multicolored paint of the typical Chinese decorations on its railings have been replaced by anti-rust primer, the structure appeared essentially the same as when I filmed it 58 years ago.
This sphere is on the other side up there.
它是循环。
Other side over there. No? Oh, wait.
Oh!
No, yes, this is it right here. This is that's the exact same one right there. That's it. I found it.
是排列那时候不是有这个粉红色嘛？它是争取这个大家的意见。第一步呢，先油成这一个红色，最后确定是灰颜色。
What is beautiful to me is this whole panorama of the new bridge across the new city. These buildings here, continuing the new city. The whole new city, the Yangtze going off into the distance. Beautiful. Right.
In 1957, I filmed many of the construction workers on the bridge. Although, for obvious reasons, I didn't see the same men and women in 2015, I did manage to meet several people who'd been involved in its construction. One was the 86-year-old Mr. Zhao Yu Cheng, the other Mr. Qian Shuxin, who was 93.
In Paris at the time, at the University of Paris.
Mr. Qian was the inventor of the large-scale pile foundation process, the engineering procedure used to build the 8 giant piers which support the Wuhan Yangtze River Bridge. Back in 1957, it was a new type of construction method first developed in China. Today, the same method continues to be used in many bridge projects. Mr. Qian explained the theory behind his bridge building method. Although we hadn't met there, Mr. Zhao told me that as a young student of engineering, he'd also attended the 6th World Youth Festival in Moscow and was a member of the official Chinese delegation there.
You wrote this.
Reading. It's Sovietsky Prutyav.
Sovietsky Prutyav.
Sovietsky Druzhby.
Yeah, friendship, Russian friendship. Russian, Sovietsky, Druzhba, friendship.
The plan, okay.
Yeah. Sui. Say Sui, friendship, Sui. Ho Ping Wan Sui.
My name.
Yes.
And the family. Engineer of construction of Yangtze Bridge. Cao Yucheng.
I participated in a seminar at the Lomonosov University.
到参观了莫斯科大学。 高的。
On the hill above.
对。
Yeah. So we were both there at the same time.
During the Moscow Festival, on July 31st, 1957, the Americans invited their Chinese counterparts to a party. Then, on August 5th, the Chinese delegation did the same in return. As far as I knew, those gatherings constituted the first non-governmental contacts between Americans and Chinese since the end of the Korean War in 1953. A few days later, along with groups from several other nations, all of the Americans attending the Moscow Youth Festival were invited by the All-China Federation of Democratic Youth to visit China. Back then, the U.S. Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, had forbidden all Americans from entering China. Those who dared to disobey were warned that they risked being jailed, fined, or otherwise severely punished. Despite this, more than 40 of the 180 or so Americans attending the Moscow Festival announced their intention to accept the invitation to China. I was approached by Irving R. Levine, the Moscow correspondent of NBC television. Irv Levine said that if I was prepared to accompany the Americans who were defying the travel ban, NBC TV would lend me a 16mm camera, give me whatever film they had available, and name me as their special correspondent. After a short hesitation, I decided to accept the assignment and any risks that it entailed. So it was that after 9 days traveling across the USSR on the Trans-Siberian Railway, on August 23, 1957, I entered China. Being invited to China and then being permitted to film whatever I saw there indicated to me that just as Khrushchev had staged the Moscow Youth Festival in order to lessen the tensions of the Cold War, on September 7, 1957, the then Premier of China, Zhou Enlai, met with a group of 41 young Americans, including myself, in the seat of the State Council in Beijing. Each of us was permitted one question. My question concerned what appeared to be the contradiction of China's maintaining relations with other nations even though they had anti-communist domestic policies. Zhou Enlai's answer made it clear that China was open to friendly relations with all nations, even if they opposed communism within their own borders. Since the end of the Cold War, especially since the early 1980s, it has become clear that despite their differing political systems, trade between China and the USA is an essential part of international relations. This is the Johns Hopkins University Nanjing University Center for Chinese and American Studies. It has been almost 30 years since these two prestigious schools began the first cooperation project between Chinese and American institutions of higher education. I learned a great deal about it from Dr. Cornelius C. Kubler, the current chairman from Johns Hopkins.
Early 1980s, shortly after the U.S. and the PRC established diplomatic relations, the presidents of the Johns Hopkins University on the one hand and Nanjing University on the other began to have the idea of founding a center for Chinese and American studies where half of the students would be Chinese, the other half would be American, and that center would be located here at Nanjing University. And then in 1986, the center was founded. So this is actually our 30th year. We're going to be celebrating our 30th anniversary next June 18th. Our students are in their mid-20s on average, and spending a year here at HNC, Hopkins Nanjing Center, is a very special place. Students tend to bond, the Chinese students with the American and international students. There's a saying in Chinese, 同甘共苦, together the sweet and jointly the bitter. So they play together, they study together, they suffer together, they have fun together, and so on.
The future of relations between China and the United States depends to a large extent upon the exchange of information and ideas between young people. It is to the advantage of both nations to provide such opportunities for their populations to overcome differences in culture and to join in developing solutions to worldwide problems. These are two students in Nanjing University's Center for Chinese and American Studies. Sun Jiwei is from China, while Lincoln is from the USA. Their living in the same dormitory is part of the center's effort to strengthen cultural exchange between China and the USA on a person-to-person basis.
在这样一个环境当中，其实每天比如我跟 Lincoln 都可以既说英文又说中文，这样促进自己的这个语言上面的训练是一方面，另外一方面主要还是中美交流比较多嘛，文化的交流、思想的交流等等，在中心这个大杂烩的家庭当中得到了充分的这种碰撞和摩擦。
现在美国人比较害怕中国吧，说就是普遍的这种人他们不理解，因为中国是非常复杂的地方，然后也不能就是一概而论，对吧？
但其实你到国内之后发现其实是有一定差距的，是吧？
对，非常大。它是一种不了解的害怕。它是一种怎么说 unknown， 它是不了解，对，大部分都是。但是我说的是大众啊，不是受过教育的人，我觉得那种对，有一些像智库的那些 bookings 那些地方，或者是 CS。
Founded over 100 years ago, Nanjing University is one of the oldest institutions of higher learning in China. In 1920, it led the movement to provide equal opportunity for women when it became the first university in China to defy the taboo by admitting 8 female students, an act which caused a sensation throughout the country. Since ancient times, the status of women in China has been so low that permitting them to attend an institution of higher learning, especially with men, was considered revolutionary. The empire had been overthrown 12 years earlier, but feudal thinking remained so deeply ingrained that permitting women to receive higher education at all was still looked upon as outrageous.
This looks like the research library. This looks like the same building that I filmed in 1957. The lettering wasn't on the front. Let me go see.
Here, as in the other communist states, all education is paid for and controlled by the government. Although admissions to the universities are determined by very stiff examinations, they are filled to their limits. In the new dormitories at Nanking University, 10 men are crammed into a 10 by 15-foot room. In the university library are the latest technical and medical books from the West. This one was published by the U.S. Navy Department only a few months before getting here.
The dormitories, of course, have been changed. The rickshaws, pedicabs are gone. It's no longer, 8 students to a dormitory. But some of the buildings still remain. Some of them are still here.
The new campus of Nanjing University, located in Xianlin, has over 27,600 students. One of the buildings here looked quite similar to one of the 19th century buildings that I'd photographed on the old campus back in 1957. This is the university's impressive new library.
I'm standing here in front of this brand new library. It's the Du Xiao Library at Nanjing University. Du Xiao, born in 1948, was an industrialist who contributed the funds to build this building. It houses 5 million books. It's one of the finest libraries in China, one of the 3 great university libraries in the country. And very typical of the new university library structure throughout China. I'm standing here at the base of the steps leading to the tomb of Sun Yat-sen, the founder of China, a medical doctor whose lecturing and writing contributed to the overthrow of the empire in 1911. He died in 1925. He was originally buried in Beijing, but this beautiful mausoleum was built by the nationalists, by the Kuomintang, from 1926 to 1929, and then his body was brought here and is entombed up above, the tomb of Sun Yat-sen.
Today, in the 21st century, China's rise as a world power appears unstoppable. The dream of China as a powerful and independent nation envisioned by Sun Yat-sen over 100 years ago has come to pass. While today's increasingly industrialized and militarily powerful China may be welcomed by some and feared by others, it certainly can't be ignored. In a shopping mall, during the television coverage of the September 2015 military parade in Beijing, commemorating the defeat of the Japanese invaders at the end of the Second World War, I noticed that while several Chinese sat and watched the speeches and procession of planes, tanks, and rocket launchers, there were others who continued shopping. My overall impression was that while demanding respect as a world power, today's average Chinese prefers a quiet and peaceful life to anything else.
This is your dream completed. You've been working so hard for as long as I've known you to get to this place. And we're here. And I have goosebumps. We almost lost it when you fell. And I didn't think we'd get here. But we're here now. And it's amazing. Thank you.
回中国就是看走那么多地方，看那个变化多大，我觉得这是非常有用。这个帮助我们了解中国的变化，也帮助我们了解美国人怎么看中国。我觉得这两方面都有。我觉得这两个国家的那个关系是世界上未来最重要的两国的关系因为这两个国家经济最强。那个物理怎么说？那个 military 也非常强我觉得他们对于世界各地方的影响很大。如果他们不能融合，我觉得这个会影响全世界，不只会影响这两个国家。
好一朵美